Why does Donald Trump, a man who fashions himself as a president of peace, a man who has won the equally prestigious as it is historical FIFA Peace Prize, and the man who one day wishes to win a Nobel Peace Prize, find himself fighting so many wars? His first term was not like this. He conducted a handful of strikes in Syria and also assassinated one of Iran's top military officials. But he avoided starting any major new hostilities, the first president to do that since at least Reagan, depending on how you want to count things. This time around, the Pentagon has been a bit busier. There was a 2-month war against the Houthis in March 2025, then the one-day operation against Iran's nuclear program in June, then a long period of anti-cartel operations along the coast of Venezuela, culminating in Maduro's capture in January. Now we have the Iran war. Plus he has sprinkled in a handful of other, more limited strikes to fill in some gaps. We also have some intrigue brewing in Cuba, but let's hold off our discussion on that for another day. Prior to Operation Epic Fury, which somehow just got autocorrected to Operation Septic Fury for me, yikes, Trump's America First base was willing to put up with his new doctrine. It might not have been the isolationism that they had envisioned, but the military strategy had a light footprint. Whatever the United States did, it did not commit too much to the region, and there was little downside risk to the country. A repeat of the George W. Bush-era wars, this was not. Now, polling indicates that only a fraction of Trump's MAGA base has splintered off due to the Iran war. But those disenchanted individuals are asking themselves the aforementioned question all the same. How does a president of peace get involved in so many conflicts? Well, today, I want to cover 3 problems with the idea of Donald Trump peace president, leading to fewer wars in practice. 1. That the premise of a peace president may not be exactly accurate here. 2. That the logical mapping of someone liking peace and there being more peace fundamentally misunderstands the causes of war. Yes, we will have some lines. And 3. Having greater disutility for war can even cause more wars under some circumstances. Yep, there will be more lines. Oh, and if you stick around for long enough, I will go on an unhinged rant about the Nobel Peace Prize and Trump's apparent irrationality. But let's quickly question that initial premise of Trump being a peace president. I am not exactly sure how to define that idea beyond Trump not placing as much value on the types of international outcomes as the traditional Washington consensus would. Actually, I think it is reasonable to believe that that is true, even if the extent of it is exaggerated. Nonetheless, you can see the exaggeration part in the coalition that Trump built to win the 2024 presidential election. America First isolationists heard what they wanted to hear, while America First, we will do what we want where we want folks, heard the catchphrase and also immediately concluded it meant their version of it, even though those two things run opposite of each other. I think it is obviously true that Trump cares less about the international order than any president since the international order came into existence. It is otherwise very hard to explain his stances on Ukraine, and some, though not all, of his NATO activities. But to think that applies more broadly is a bit of a leap. Let's not forget that Iran hired agents in the United States to assassinate Trump, forcing the Biden administration to declare that any such attempts would be an act of war. And in more mundane affairs, he chose basically the most hawkish person in the Washington blob vis-a-vis China as his Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Point is, I think that the premise of this argument is questionable. But let's put it back up there and then see how the rest of it still falls apart. I know that it may seem weird, but more peace does not necessarily follow from likes more peace. Now, if you have been around the block with me enough times before, you know that you need a bargaining friction to explain why any war can happen. That is because war is costly, and both parties would be better off reaching a deal commensurate with the expected outcome of war. Such deals are close to what fighting would produce, but they do not result in, massive death and destruction. So when we are looking at an argument like this, whatever is linking peace president to fewer wars must be operating through how it connects with bargaining frictions. There is a tempting logic to fall victim to here. If Trump does not value international stakes all that much, that effectively raises his costs for war. Remember, how costly war is to an actor is a ratio of the actual physical costs compared to the value of the stakes. If you think that the stakes are low, then correspondingly, you have high perceived costs of war. That would imply that Trump has a larger disutility for war, and thus the range of mutually acceptable settlements expands. Larger bargaining range, easier to reach a deal, right? Well, in many cases, that is true. The size of a bargaining range does matter, but it is not generally true that bigger is better, as we will get to in a minute. First, though, there is a more pressing point to address. Even if we think that a peace president reduces the impact of bargaining frictions, which then leads to fewer wars, we still cannot conclude that Trump himself reduces conflict in practice. That is because we are also implicitly assuming that Trump holds all other factors equal. And I do not think that Trump holds all other factors equal. Just to clarify the scope of what I am talking about here, I want to limit this conversation to Trump-specific items. It is also true that we are in a more dangerous security environment now than a decade ago, aside from anything that Trump did. And I think that helps explain some of the differences between Trump's first term and now his second. But sticking to the Trump-specific problems, Trump creates bargaining frictions. I am not saying this as some sort of edgy commentary that he creates problems where problems do not need to exist. This is not a conversation about his temperament. Rather, I mean that he is generally hard to read, and that makes it difficult for anyone, allies or adversaries, to understand exactly what his bottom line is in negotiations. This leads to more situations where the United States fights wars because the opposing party is unsure what to demand in negotiations. We could be in a Taco-esque situation where he is willing to concede just about all of the issues at stake, or he might be fairly resolved and willing to fight unless his opponent makes a serious offer. If the opponent is thinking that the White House is having tacos for dinner tonight, then it makes a stringent demand. But then an actually resolved Trump rejects. War ensues. Bringing the argument together, imagine that Trump cares a little bit less about international outcomes than his predecessors, but he injects a ton more uncertainty into the situation. Then it is possible that the latter effect dominates. The original argument falls apart because it is not considering the total Trump effect. Unfortunately, I can show that the problem somehow gets worse. Comparing the sizes of bargaining ranges does not tell us anything about the likelihood of war, because it does not specify any mechanism that causes bargaining breakdown. And sometimes caring less about international outcomes can lead to more war. Let me explain. Imagine that we live in a world of uncertainty, where Iran does not know Trump's bottom line. Perhaps that is because it is unclear how deep US weapons stockpiles run, and therefore fighting in Iran will produce an unclear extent of negative side effects regarding other US interests, like the ability to later fight against China. Under these circumstances, a primary determinant of whether war results is the difference between Trump's two possible true minimum demands. I call this difference the peace premium. That is because it is the amount that the opponent must overpay the less committed type of Trump to ensure that the more committed type of Trump accepts the proposal. Thus, making a risky proposal looks less attractive from the opponent's perspective when the peace premium is small. That is because it is risking its own costs of war to have a small chance of extracting some extra amount of the good. But that extra amount is small. Not exactly a worthwhile gamble. Well, a few years ago, one of the things that my self-respecting academic alter ego discovered, remember, he is actually a professor and actually a game theorist, is that the peace premium is larger when the leader cares less about the stakes. Holding fixed the possible physical costs of war, A Trump that cares a bunch about the stakes would have possible minimum values that look like this, while a Trump that cares a little about the stakes would have possible minimum values that look like this. Intuitively, Trump caring more brings both of these possibilities closer to the expected outcome of war, because he is generally more willing to bear whatever the true costs are. Equivalently, they expand outward when Trump generally cares less. However, the key here is that the peace premium is smaller when Trump cares more, and it is larger when Trump cares less. Consequently, Trump caring more mitigates the bargaining friction. For those of you who live and breathe second derivatives, enjoy the moment, because they finally mattered in a social science setting. The best intuitive explanation that I can give you for why it works this way is because of what happens in the extreme case. Imagine that Trump placed infinite value on the good at stake. Then whether the United States has large or small physical costs of war is inconsequential. As a result, the true cost of war is basically irrelevant. The opponent must give Trump war's expected outcome to appease him, precisely because he practically ignores the costs of fighting. You need Trump to care less about the stakes for a meaningful difference in the disutilities to arise. Thus, the very possibility that Donald Trump is a peace president can ironically cause more war. Let me go one step further by heading to Norway and analyzing how the Nobel Peace Prize plays into this problem. Check the comments, and you will often see suggestions that we as outsiders should abandon all logical analysis of the Trump administration strategy. After all, Trump himself is irrational. Within that subset of comments, what I find amusing is that most of the descriptions of Trump's irrationality do not actually describe irrationality in a strategic or social science sense. In colloquial English, irrational is synonymous with strange. In social science land, irrational means non-responsive to incentive structures. I am specifically raising this point here because of the connection to Trump's apparent fascination with winning a Nobel Peace Prize, which immediately elicits comments about his rationality. But the fun thing about modeling crisis bargaining is that we do not have to care about Trump's daddy issues or whatever allegedly caused his lust for the Nobel. He just has it. And if you think about the effect that it has on negotiations, it just makes accepting a deal look more attractive. But that is mathematically equivalent to saying that war looks relatively less attractive from his perspective. And as it turns out, we already have a relative disutility for fighting compared to settling. It is the cost of war. Thus, adding a benefit to peace is the same as subtracting more out from fighting. You may think that his perspective is absurd and not very sensible, but the practical effect of it on crisis bargaining is that Trump just pays a higher cost of war. It is amazing what you can mathematically model with a single plus or minus sign. And it fortunately means that crisis bargaining theory can cover a ton more situations than some uninformed commenters would like you to believe. Funny enough, my academic alter ego has a related paper that shows another counterintuitive relationship. Imagine that states have a hard time gauging Trump's precise valuation for a particular issue at stake. Then increasing the cost of war, including by adding the value of a Nobel Prize, raises the risk of war. Now, the logic here is the same sort of problem with manipulating the peace premium as before, so I will not discuss that in further depth today. But it is interesting that we have yet another way that peace can look more attractive at first blush, yet the strategic interaction ultimately quashes that connection. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? The label of Trump as a peace president may be misleading. Even if he is, what causes war is the presence of bargaining frictions. And it is possible that being a peace president causes more war due to interactions with the bargaining friction. Thus marks the end of day 31 in a row for me. I am out of words, so go watch something I have said before. Might I suggest the latest entry in my Introduction to International Relations series over on Lines on Maps Extra? Either way, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. and I will see you next time. Take care.